Have you ever wondered what happened to the most terrifying objects mentioned in the Bible? Objects so cursed, so dangerous, that they brought death, destruction, and divine judgment upon anyone who dared to touch them. Objects that were feared by kings, destroyed entire armies, and caused plagues to sweep across nations. Tonight, we're going to uncover the truth about these biblical artifacts that have been lost to history. Some were buried in secret locations, others were deliberately destroyed, and a few may still exist today, hidden in places you would never expect. But here's what will shock you the most. The power these objects possessed wasn't just spiritual folklore. It was real, it was documented, and it was absolutely terrifying. From the golden calf that sparked God's wrath in the wilderness, to the cursed silver from Judas's betrayal, from the brazen serpent that became an idol to the ark that no man could touch and live. These weren't just religious symbols. They were weapons of divine judgment that could level cities and topple empires with a single touch. But what happened to them? Where did they go? Are they still out there, waiting in some forgotten vault or buried treasure? And more importantly, if someone found them today, would they still carry that same terrifying power? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about biblical history. Some of these objects have been found. Others are still being searched for by archaeologists and treasure hunters around the world. And a few may be closer than you think. If you're ready to dive deep into this mystery, leave 7 sevens in the comments and let's begin this incredible journey together. Trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why these cursed objects were either hidden away forever or destroyed completely, because the alternative was too dangerous for humanity to bear. Let's start with the most infamous cursed object in biblical history. An object so dangerous that it killed people just for looking at it wrong. An object that brought plagues upon entire nations and caused the ground itself to split open and swallow men alive. The Ark of the Covenant. Now, most people think they know the story of the Ark. They picture that golden box from Indiana Jones, glowing with supernatural power. But the real Ark was far more terrifying than any Hollywood movie could ever portray. This wasn't just a container for stone tablets. This was the dwelling place of the Almighty God Himself, and it carried with it the full weight of divine judgment. The Ark was constructed according to precise specifications given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. It was made of acacia wood, overlaid with pure gold inside and out. On top sat the mercy seat, flanked by 2 golden cherubim whose wings overshadowed the sacred space where God's presence would manifest. But here's what they don't tell you in Sunday school. This object was so holy, so charged with divine power, that even the priests who carried it could be struck dead if they made the slightest mistake. Remember Uzzah? He was a good man, trying to do the right thing. When the oxen stumbled and the ark began to tip, he instinctively reached out to steady it. The moment his hand touched that golden surface, he was dead, struck down instantly by the power of God. David himself was so terrified by what he witnessed that he refused to bring the ark to Jerusalem for 3 months. But that was just the beginning. Wherever the ark went, supernatural phenomena followed. When the Philistines captured it in battle, thinking they had seized some kind of magical weapon, they quickly learned their mistake. The statue of their god Dagon fell on its face before the ark, then broke into pieces. Tumors and plagues swept through their cities. People died by the thousands. They couldn't get rid of the ark fast enough. For centuries, the ark resided in Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. But then something happened that changed everything. The temple was destroyed, Jerusalem fell, and the ark vanished without a trace. Where did it go? This is where the mystery deepens and the theories multiply. Some say the prophet Jeremiah hid it in a cave on Mount Nebo before the Babylonians could seize it. Others believe it was taken to Ethiopia by the Queen of Sheba's son, where it supposedly rests today in a small chapel in Aksum, guarded by a single monk who claims to be its protector. But here's what's truly unsettling. If the Ark still exists, if it's still out there somewhere, does it still carry that same deadly power? Think about it. This object once caused the walls of Jericho to crumble, parted the Jordan River, and struck down anyone who approached it irreverently. If someone found it today, would they survive the encounter? There are treasure hunters and archaeologists who have spent their entire lives searching for the Ark. Some claim to have found evidence of its location. Others have mysteriously disappeared while pursuing their quest. Is it coincidence, or is there still something protecting this ancient relic from being discovered? But the Ark of the Covenant wasn't the only cursed object that brought death and destruction in biblical times. There was another artifact, one that started as a symbol of healing, but became a source of idolatry so dangerous that a righteous king had to destroy it completely. The bronze serpent that Moses crafted in the wilderness. You remember the story. The Israelites were complaining against God and Moses in the desert, so the Lord sent poisonous serpents among them. People were dying from the snake bites, crying out for mercy. God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and anyone who looked at it after being bitten would live. It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? A symbol of God's mercy, a way of salvation for the dying, and for a time, that's exactly what it was. But here's what happened next, and this is where the story takes a dark turn. The Israelites kept that bronze serpent. Generation after generation, they preserved it, honored it, and eventually began to worship it. By the time of King Hezekiah, hundreds of years later, the people were burning incense to this bronze serpent. They had turned a symbol of God's healing into an idol, a false god that competed with the worship of the true God. The bronze serpent had become so corrupted, so spiritually dangerous, that Hezekiah had no choice but to destroy it completely. He broke it into pieces and called it Nehushtan, which means piece of bronze, to show how worthless it had become. But think about this for a moment. An object that once carried the power to heal the dying had become so cursed through idolatry that it had to be utterly destroyed. What does that tell us about the spiritual forces at work with these biblical artifacts? How can something blessed by God become a source of spiritual poison? This pattern repeats throughout biblical history. Objects of power, created for holy purposes, becoming corrupted and dangerous when misused by human hands. And that brings us to perhaps the most tragic cursed object of all, the 30 pieces of silver that sealed the fate of Judas Iscariot and changed the course of human history forever. Most people know the story. Judas, one of the 12 disciples, went to the chief priests and asked what they would give him to betray Jesus. They counted out 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave according to Jewish law. It was an insult, really. The Son of God sold for the price of a common servant. But what happened to those silver coins after Judas threw them back into the temple? The priests couldn't put them back into the temple treasury because it was blood money, so they used the silver to buy a potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. They called it the Field of Blood. Here's what's chilling about this story. Those 30 pieces of silver didn't just disappear into history. They became the foundation of a place associated with death, with the burial of the unwanted and forgotten. Every time someone was laid to rest in that field, it was a reminder of the betrayal that led to the crucifixion of Christ. But there's more to this story that most people never consider. What if those silver coins still exist somewhere? What if they've been passed down through generations, carrying with them the spiritual weight of the ultimate betrayal? Throughout history, there have been claims of people finding silver coins that supposedly came from Judas's payment. Some of these coins have been associated with mysterious deaths, financial ruin, and family curses that span generations. Is it possible that objects can carry spiritual curses across centuries? Can silver touched by betrayal continue to bring destruction to those who possess it? These are questions that go beyond archaeology and history into the realm of spiritual warfare that the Bible clearly acknowledges as real. And speaking of objects that brought curses upon families and nations, we cannot forget about the golden calf that Aaron crafted in the wilderness. This wasn't just a religious mistake, it was the creation of a cursed object that brought death to 3,000 Israelites in a single day. Picture the scene. Moses had been on Mount Sinai for 40 days and nights, receiving the law from God. The people grew restless, afraid that he wasn't coming back. So they came to Aaron and demanded that he make them gods to go before them. Aaron collected their gold jewelry, melted it down, and shaped it into the form of a calf. What happened next was one of the most devastating judgments in biblical history. When Moses came down from the mountain and saw the people dancing around this golden idol, his anger burned so hot that he threw down the stone tablets and broke them. But the real curse wasn't Moses' anger. It was God's judgment. Moses ground the golden calf into powder, mixed it with water, and made the Israelites drink it. Then he called for the sons of Levi to take their swords and go through the camp, killing their brothers, friends and neighbors who had participated in this idolatry. 3,000 people died that day because of a golden statue. But here's what's truly terrifying about this account. The golden calf wasn't just destroyed and forgotten. The consequences of creating it rippled through Israel's history for generations. This single act of idolatry established a pattern of rebellion and spiritual adultery that would eventually lead to the destruction of the kingdom and the exile of God's people. The curse wasn't just in the object itself, it was in what the object represented. The human tendency to create gods in our own image, to worship the work of our hands instead of the God who made us. And that curse has followed humanity ever since. These cursed objects from biblical history weren't just ancient relics. They were warnings, demonstrations of what happens when human beings try to manipulate spiritual power for their own purposes. Each one tells a story of divine judgment, of the dangerous line between the sacred and the profane. But our investigation is far from over. These are just the beginning of the cursed objects mentioned in Scripture. There are others, equally dangerous, equally mysterious. Objects that brought plagues, caused madness, and destroyed entire bloodlines. What about the objects that weren't just destroyed but were transformed by human sin into instruments of spiritual darkness? Objects that should have brought blessing but instead became conduits for demonic influence and supernatural terror. Take the ephod that Gideon created after his victory over the Midianites. This is a story that most people have never heard, but it reveals something chilling about how quickly blessed objects can become cursed when pride enters the picture. Gideon had just led Israel to one of the greatest military victories in their history. With only 300 men, he had routed an army of over 100,000 Midianites. The people were so impressed that they wanted to make him king, but Gideon refused the crown. Instead, he made what seemed like a reasonable request. He asked for a portion of the golden earrings taken from the enemy soldiers. The Israelites gladly gave him the gold, and from it, Gideon made an ephod. Now, an ephod was supposed to be a priestly garment, a holy vestment used in worship and seeking God's guidance. But something went terribly wrong with Gideon's ephod. The Bible tells us that all Israel played the harlot with it, and it became a snare to Gideon and his house. What does that mean exactly? It means this object, created by a man of God from the spoils of a divinely granted victory, became a source of spiritual prostitution. The people began worshipping it, seeking guidance from it instead of from God. The very thing that was meant to honor the Lord became a rival to him, and the curse didn't stop there. Gideon's family was destroyed. His 70 sons were murdered by their half-brother Abimelech, who used the wealth associated with that cursed ephod to hire mercenaries and seize power. The man who had refused to be king watched his dynasty collapse into bloodshed and betrayal, all because he created an object that drew people away from the true God. Where did that ephod end up? The Bible doesn't tell us. It simply vanished from the record, but the destruction it caused echoed through generations. This is the terrifying pattern we see repeatedly. Objects meant for holy purposes becoming instruments of spiritual seduction and family destruction. But perhaps no cursed object in biblical history has captured the imagination quite like the head of John the Baptist. Not the man himself, but what happened to his severed head after Herod's grotesque birthday celebration. This wasn't just a political execution. This was the silencing of the voice of God, and the consequences were immediate and supernatural. You know the story. Herod had imprisoned John for condemning his unlawful marriage to his brother's wife, Herodias. During his birthday feast, Herodias' daughter danced so beautifully that Herod promised her anything she wanted, up to half his kingdom. Prompted by her mother, she asked for John's head on a platter. The moment that head was severed, something shifted in the spiritual realm. John wasn't just a prophet. He was the forerunner of Christ, the voice crying in the wilderness, the last of the Old Testament prophets. His death marked a transition point in biblical history, but it also released a curse upon those responsible. Historical records tell us that Herod's life spiraled into madness and paranoia after John's execution. When he later heard about Jesus performing miracles, his immediate fear was that John had risen from the dead. The guilt and supernatural terror haunted him until his dying day. But what happened to the actual head? What happened to that gruesome trophy that Herodias demanded? Ancient traditions claim that the head was buried secretly by John's disciples, but other accounts suggest something far more disturbing. Some historical sources indicate that Herodias kept the head, that she would stab the tongue with needles in fits of rage, trying to silence even in death the voice that had condemned her sin. If these accounts are true, then we're dealing with an object that carried not just the memory of martyrdom, but the spiritual weight of silencing God's messenger. Throughout church history, there have been claims of people discovering relics associated with John the Baptist. And many of these discoveries have been accompanied by unexplained phenomena, miraculous healings, but also strange deaths and supernatural encounters. Could the head of John the Baptist still exist somewhere? Could it still carry the power of the prophet who prepared the way for Christ? These questions have driven relic hunters and archaeologists for centuries, but they've also led to mysterious disappearances and unexplained tragedies among those who claim to be close to finding it. The pattern continues with King Saul's armor after his suicide on Mount Gilboa. This wasn't just the equipment of a defeated king. This was the armor worn by God's first anointed king of Israel during his descent into madness and rebellion. By the end of his life, Saul was consulting mediums, pursuing David with murderous intent, and ignoring the voice of God completely. When the Philistines found Saul's body on the battlefield, they cut off his head and stripped off his armor. They sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the house of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, the pagan goddess of fertility and war. Think about the spiritual implications of this. The armor that once protected God's anointed king was placed in the temple of a demon. It became a trophy in the house of Israel's spiritual enemies, a symbol of how far the kingdom had fallen from God's blessing. But the curse didn't end with display. That armor carried with it the spiritual contamination of Saul's rebellion, his descent into occult practices, and his ultimate rejection by God. Any nation or people who possessed it would be handling an object saturated with divine judgment and supernatural rebellion. The Philistines learned this lesson the hard way. Not long after displaying Saul's armor as a trophy, their power began to wane. David rose to become king, and the Philistines never again posed the same threat to Israel that they had during Saul's reign. The very trophy they thought represented their victory became a monument to their eventual defeat. These accounts reveal something crucial about cursed objects in biblical history. They weren't cursed because of some magical properties inherent in the materials themselves. They were cursed because of what they represented spiritually: rebellion against God, the worship of false idols, the corruption of holy purposes, or the silencing of divine truth. But here's where our investigation takes an even darker turn. What about the objects that were specifically created to channel demonic power? Objects that weren't corrupted by misuse, but were designed from the beginning to serve as conduits for supernatural evil. The teraphim that Rachel stole from her father Laban represent exactly this kind of cursed artifact. These weren't innocent household items. They were idols, objects used for divination and consulting with familiar spirits. When Rachel took them, she wasn't just stealing property. She was bringing objects of occult power into the household of Jacob, the man chosen by God to father the 12 tribes of Israel. The consequences were immediate and tragic. Rachel, who had been barren for years, finally conceived and gave birth to Joseph. But when she conceived again with Benjamin, the birth cost her life. She died in childbirth, crying out in her final moments that her son's name should be Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. Was this just a coincidence? Or was there a spiritual connection between the cursed objects Rachel had stolen and the tragedy that befell her? The Bible doesn't explicitly make this connection, but the pattern is unmistakable. Those who traffic in objects of occult power often pay a price that extends far beyond what they initially bargained for. The teraphim themselves vanished from the biblical record, but their influence may have lingered in Jacob's family for generations. The favoritism Jacob showed toward Joseph, the jealousy of his brothers, the deception and family conflict that marked their relationships. Could these have been influenced by the spiritual contamination that Rachel brought into their household? These questions matter because they reveal the true nature of cursed objects in biblical history. They're not just archaeological curiosities or religious artifacts. They're windows into the spiritual warfare that has raged throughout human history, the ongoing battle between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness. And this brings us to perhaps the most mysterious and potentially dangerous cursed object mentioned in Scripture, the image of the beast described in the book of Revelation. Unlike the historical objects we've discussed, this cursed artifact belongs to the future, but its power will surpass anything the world has ever seen. The Apostle John describes a time when a false prophet will create an image of the beast and give it breath so that it can speak. This image will demand worship from all people, and those who refuse will be killed. It sounds like science fiction, but remember, John was describing something he actually saw in his vision of the end times. What kind of object could have such power? How could an image be given breath and the ability to speak? How could it enforce worship on a global scale? These questions have puzzled biblical scholars for centuries, but recent advances in artificial intelligence and robotics have made John's vision seem less impossible and more prophetic. Could the image of the beast be some kind of advanced AI system, a technological creation that appears to have life and consciousness? Could it be a holographic projection with the ability to interact with and control human behavior? The Bible doesn't give us technical details, but it does tell us that this object will be the focal point of the greatest spiritual deception in human history. And unlike the cursed objects of the past, which brought judgment on individuals or nations, the image of the beast will bring eternal damnation to all who worship it. The book of Revelation makes it clear that anyone who receives the mark of the beast or worships its image will drink of the wine of God's wrath and be tormented with fire and brimstone forever. This isn't just another cursed object. It's the ultimate cursed object, the final and most dangerous artifact in the spiritual war between good and evil. And according to biblical prophecy, it's still coming. But what if some of these cursed objects from biblical times are still out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered? What if the very museums and private collections that house ancient artifacts are unknowingly preserving instruments of divine judgment and supernatural terror? This brings us to one of the most unsettling aspects of our investigation. Throughout history, there have been countless reports of archaeological discoveries that seemed blessed at first, but quickly turned into nightmares for those who possessed them. Ancient tablets that drove scholars to madness, golden vessels that brought financial ruin to entire families, stone carvings that seemed to whisper in the darkness of museum storage rooms. Consider the curse that followed the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. While not biblical, it established a pattern that archaeologists have seen repeated with other ancient religious artifacts. Those who disturbed the tomb began dying under mysterious circumstances. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others wondered if certain objects carry with them a spiritual weight that transcends time and culture. Now imagine that same principle applied to biblical artifacts. What if someone discovered fragments of the golden calf, melted down, but still carrying the spiritual contamination of Israel's greatest act of rebellion? What if pieces of the brazen serpent survived Hezekiah's destruction, scattered to the winds but still holding the power that once healed the dying and later corrupted an entire nation? The truth is, we may never know how many cursed biblical objects are sitting in private collections, museums, or archaeological storage facilities around the world. The men and women who work with these artifacts often report strange dreams, unexplained illnesses, and patterns of misfortune that seem to follow them home from work. But there's another category of cursed objects that we haven't discussed yet, and these might be the most dangerous of all. Objects that weren't just used in biblical times, but were specifically created to mock or oppose the God of Israel. Objects that carried with them not just the weight of human sin, but the active malevolence of spiritual forces that hate everything God represents. The golden image that Nebuchadnezzar erected on the plain of Dura represents exactly this kind of object. This wasn't just a statue. It was a direct challenge to the God of Israel, a 90-foot-tall monument to human pride and demonic rebellion. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down to it, they weren't just making a religious statement. They were refusing to worship an object that had been designed specifically to replace their God. The fiery furnace that was meant to execute them for their refusal became instead a demonstration of God's power over the cursed object that Nebuchadnezzar had created. But what happened to that golden image after Nebuchadnezzar's humbling? The Bible doesn't tell us, but historical records suggest that it stood for years as a monument to the king's pride before eventually being destroyed by later conquerors. Yet fragments of that statue, pieces of that cursed monument, could still exist somewhere in the ruins of ancient Babylon. And if they do, they would carry with them the spiritual weight of the greatest act of religious defiance in the Old Testament. They would be objects specifically created to challenge the authority of the living God, and that makes them infinitely more dangerous than artifacts that were simply corrupted by human misuse. This pattern of objects created specifically to oppose God continues throughout biblical history. The altars that King Ahab built for Baal weren't just religious structures. They were platforms for child sacrifice, places where innocent blood was shed in worship of demonic forces. When the prophet Elijah called down fire from heaven and slaughtered the prophets of Baal, he wasn't just winning a religious debate. He was destroying a network of cursed objects that had been used to channel supernatural evil into the kingdom of Israel. But here's what's truly chilling about this account. Those altars weren't completely destroyed that day. Elijah demolished the altar on Mount Carmel, but throughout Israel, there remained dozens of other high places, other altars, other cursed objects that continue to poison the spiritual atmosphere of the nation. It took generations of righteous kings, each one systematically destroying these monuments to evil, before Israel was finally cleansed of their influence. And even then, the cleansing wasn't complete. Archaeological excavations throughout Israel have uncovered evidence of these ancient high places, altars where children were sacrificed to Moloch and other demonic entities. Some of these sites show evidence of being used for hundreds of years, generation after generation of people bringing their offerings to cursed objects that promise power but delivered only death and destruction. What's most disturbing is that many of these archaeological sites show signs of recent activity. Burned offerings, ritual markings, evidence that people in the modern era have discovered these ancient cursed objects and attempted to reactivate them for their own purposes. The objects that once brought judgment upon ancient Israel may still be drawing people into spiritual darkness today. This brings us to a question that should terrify anyone who understands the spiritual realities revealed in Scripture. If these cursed objects still exist, if they still carry the same supernatural power that made them so dangerous in biblical times, what happens when they fall into the hands of people who don't understand what they're dealing with? Throughout the 20th century, there were numerous reports of Nazi occultists searching for biblical artifacts, believing they could harness their power for military purposes. Heinrich Himmler's Ahnenerbe, the Nazi organization dedicated to researching ancient mysticism, sent expeditions around the world looking for objects of supernatural power. Some of these expeditions specifically targeted sites associated with biblical history. Did they find what they were looking for? The historical record is deliberately obscure on this point, but there are disturbing accounts of Nazi experiments with artifacts claiming to be biblical in origin. Objects that supposedly drove test subjects insane, caused unexplained deaths among research staff, and produced phenomena that even hardened SS officers refused to discuss. If these accounts are true, then we're dealing with cursed objects that maintain their power across millennia, artifacts that can still bring judgment and destruction thousands of years after their creation. And if the Nazis found such objects, what happened to them after the war? Were they destroyed, hidden away, or did they fall into the hands of other groups with equally dark intentions? The same questions apply to modern archaeological expeditions and private collectors. In recent decades, there has been an explosion of interest in biblical archaeology, driven partly by religious devotion, but also by the enormous financial value of authentic biblical artifacts. Private collectors pay millions of dollars for objects that might have some connection to biblical history, often without any real understanding of what they're acquiring. What if someone purchased a fragment of stone from an altar where children were sacrificed to Molech? What if a museum acquired pottery shards from the house where the Witch of Endor conducted her seances? What if a private collector bought jewelry that once adorned a priest of Baal during ritual human sacrifice? These aren't hypothetical questions. Given the thousands of biblical artifacts that have been discovered and sold over the past century, it's almost certain that cursed objects are sitting in collections around the world right now, and the people who own them have no idea what they're dealing with. They see ancient pottery, old jewelry, fragments of stone and metal. They don't see objects that were once conduits for supernatural evil, artifacts that were created specifically to channel demonic power, or that became cursed through association with the most heinous sins in biblical history. But the objects know what they are. And according to biblical principles of spiritual warfare, they're still active, still influencing the people and places around them, still drawing susceptible individuals into the same patterns of rebellion and destruction that they facilitated thousands of years ago. This is why the study of biblical cursed objects isn't just academic curiosity. It's a matter of spiritual life and death. These artifacts represent the ongoing reality of the supernatural war between good and evil, a conflict that didn't end with the close of biblical history, but continues to this day. Consider the implications for a moment. If objects can carry spiritual curses across centuries, if they can influence the people who possess them toward rebellion against God, and involvement with supernatural evil, then the antique markets and archaeological sites of the world become potential battlegrounds in an invisible war. Every ancient artifact becomes a question mark. Every piece of biblical-era pottery or jewelry or metalwork could potentially be an object that once played a role in the spiritual darkness that repeatedly overwhelmed God's people. And the people buying, selling, and displaying these objects have no way of knowing which ones are spiritually neutral and which ones carry with them the accumulated weight of thousands of years of spiritual rebellion. But there's another aspect to this investigation that we need to consider. What about the objects that weren't cursed originally, but became cursed through their association with biblical figures who fell into sin and rebellion? Objects that started as symbols of God's blessing, but were transformed into instruments of judgment through the choices of the people who possessed them. King Solomon's throne represents exactly this kind of tragic transformation. The Bible describes it as one of the most magnificent objects ever created, made of ivory and overlaid with pure gold, with 6 steps leading up to it and 12 lions standing on the steps. It was a symbol of the wisdom and prosperity that God had given to Israel's greatest king. But Solomon's heart turned away from God. He married foreign wives who led him into idolatry. He built high places for their gods and even participated in their worship. The throne that had once been a symbol of divine blessing became the seat from which Solomon authorized the construction of altars to demons. When the kingdom was divided after Solomon's death, what happened to that magnificent throne? Some historical accounts suggest it was carried away to Egypt by Pharaoh Shishak when he plundered Jerusalem. Others claim it was hidden away before the invasion and remains buried somewhere in Israel to this day. But regardless of where it ended up, the throne had been spiritually contaminated by Solomon's apostasy. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It had become an object associated with the greatest spiritual failure in Israel's royal history, a symbol of how even the wisest man who ever lived could be led astray by the temptations of power and sensual pleasure. If that throne still exists somewhere, would it still carry the spiritual weight of Solomon's fall? Would it still have the power to influence its possessors toward the same patterns of compromise and spiritual adultery that destroyed the United Kingdom of Israel? These questions go beyond archaeology into the realm of spiritual discernment that most modern people are completely unprepared to handle. The same principle applies to David's crown, which was taken from the head of the defeated king of Ammon and placed on David's head. The Bible tells us it was made of gold and precious stones and weighed about 75 pounds. It was a symbol of military victory and divine blessing, a crown worn by the man after God's own heart. But even David fell into terrible sin. His adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah stained his reign with blood and deception. Did that crown, worn by David during the period of his greatest moral failure, become contaminated by his sin? Did it absorb the spiritual darkness of a king who had fallen from the heights of divine favor into the depths of adultery and murder? Ancient Jewish traditions suggest that David's crown was buried with him, placed in his tomb along with other royal regalia. But tomb robbers have been active in Jerusalem for thousands of years, and many royal burial sites were plundered long ago. If David's crown was stolen from his tomb, where did it end up? Who possesses it now? And what kind of spiritual influence might it exert on anyone who tries to wear it? These questions multiply when we consider all the objects associated with biblical figures who experienced both divine blessing and moral failure. The staff of Aaron that budded with almonds as a sign of God's choice became the same staff carried by a high priest who created the golden calf. The ephod worn by the high priests in Solomon's temple was the same type of garment that Gideon corrupted into an object of idolatry. Even objects blessed by God himself could become cursed through human sin and rebellion. And if they still exist somewhere in the world today, they carry with them the full weight of that spiritual history. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this investigation is the realization that cursed objects from biblical times might not be the only supernatural artifacts we need to worry about. What if the same spiritual principles that made biblical objects dangerous are still operating today? What if modern objects are becoming cursed through their association with rebellion against God and involvement with supernatural evil? Think about the implications. If an ancient altar used for child sacrifice could become a conduit for demonic power, what about modern locations where similar atrocities are committed? If objects used in biblical-era occult practices could carry spiritual curses for thousands of years? What about contemporary items used in witchcraft, Satanism, and other forms of supernatural rebellion? The principles revealed in biblical accounts of cursed objects suggest that spiritual contamination is an ongoing reality, not just a historical curiosity. Objects used in modern occult practices, items associated with contemporary rebellion against God, artifacts connected to places where innocent blood has been shed. All of these could potentially carry the same kind of spiritual danger that made biblical cursed objects so feared by those who understood their true nature. This means that the investigation of biblical cursed objects isn't just about archaeology and ancient history. It's about understanding spiritual principles that are still active today, still influencing people's lives, still creating objects and places that carry with them the power to influence human behavior toward darkness and destruction. The question that should keep us awake at night is this: how many objects in our modern world are unknowingly following the same spiritual trajectory as the cursed artifacts of biblical times? How many seemingly innocent items are slowly accumulating spiritual darkness through their association with human rebellion and supernatural evil? Consider the personal belongings of notorious criminals throughout history, the possessions of serial killers, the artifacts left behind by cult leaders, the objects owned by those who dedicated their lives to spreading darkness and death. According to the spiritual principles revealed in biblical accounts of cursed objects, these items don't just carry emotional associations or psychological influences. They may actually harbor genuine spiritual contamination that can affect anyone who comes into contact with them. This isn't superstition or religious hysteria. It's a logical extension of what we see repeatedly in biblical history. Objects becoming spiritually dangerous through their connection to evil actions and rebellious hearts. If Aaron's golden calf could bring death to thousands, if Gideon's ephod could become a snare to an entire nation, then what about the personal effects of modern-day practitioners of evil? Law enforcement agencies have reported strange phenomena associated with evidence from occult-related crimes. Officers working on cases involving ritual murder, satanic practices, or supernatural rebellion often experience unexplained illnesses, family problems, and patterns of misfortune that seem to follow them home from work. Crime scene investigators have requested transfers after handling certain types of evidence, claiming that the objects seem to carry with them an oppressive spiritual atmosphere that affected everyone who touched them. Museums that display artifacts from dark periods of human history report similar phenomena. Staff members working with objects from concentration camps, items associated with genocides, or artifacts connected to systematic evil often describe feelings of depression, anxiety, and spiritual oppression that intensify when they're handling these items. Some institutions have actually removed certain objects from display after experiencing too many unexplained incidents among their employees. But here's where the investigation takes an even more disturbing turn. What about objects that are being deliberately created today to serve as conduits for supernatural evil? Just as the altars of Baal were specifically designed to channel demonic power in biblical times, there are modern practitioners of darkness who are crafting objects intended to carry spiritual curses into contemporary society. Practitioners of modern witchcraft openly discuss the creation of cursed objects designed to bring harm to specific individuals or communities. Satanic groups perform rituals over everyday items, attempting to infuse them with malevolent spiritual energy before placing them where unsuspecting people will encounter them. These aren't just symbolic gestures or psychological warfare tactics. According to biblical principles of spiritual reality, these activities have the potential to create genuinely dangerous artifacts. Think about the implications. If someone with knowledge of occult practices performs rituals over an object and then sells it at a yard sale, gives it as a gift, or donates it to charity, that cursed item could end up in any household. The new owners would have no idea what they had acquired, no understanding of the spiritual danger they had invited into their homes. This principle extends to locations as well as objects, properties where occult practices have been performed, buildings that have been dedicated to supernatural rebellion, homes where systematic evil has been committed. All of these places may carry spiritual contamination that affects everyone who lives or works there afterward. Real estate agents in certain areas have learned to research the history of properties before showing them to clients, not just for legal reasons, but because of repeated reports of unexplained phenomena in homes with dark histories. Families move into houses that seem perfect on the surface, only to experience patterns of illness, conflict, and misfortune that didn't exist in their previous homes. Churches and ministries that specialize in spiritual warfare report being called to cleanse homes and properties where previous owners were involved in occult practices. They describe finding hidden objects, ritual items, cursed artifacts, things that were deliberately placed or buried on the property to create ongoing spiritual problems for future residents. But the most chilling aspect of this modern manifestation of cursed objects is how they're being mass-produced and distributed through normal commercial channels. Items manufactured in countries where occult practices are common may be subjected to rituals before being shipped around the world. Objects created in factories where workers practice witchcraft or other forms of supernatural rebellion could carry spiritual contamination that affects everyone who purchases them. Consider the global supply chain that brings products from every corner of the world into our homes. Clothing manufactured in regions where ancestor worship is practiced. Electronics assembled in facilities where occult rituals are performed over the production lines. Toys and household items created by people who deliberately invoke spiritual darkness over their work. According to biblical principles, any of these objects could potentially carry spiritual influences that affect the families who bring them into their homes. And unlike the cursed objects of biblical times, which were usually obvious in their spiritual danger, modern cursed artifacts are hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary consumer goods. This brings us to one of the most important questions in our entire investigation. How can we protect ourselves and our families from cursed objects, both ancient and modern? What spiritual principles should guide us in discerning which objects are safe and which ones carry hidden dangers? The Bible provides clear guidance on this issue, though most people have never been taught how to apply these principles to their daily lives. The first and most important protection is spiritual discernment, the ability to sense when an object carries spiritual contamination that could affect your family's well-being. This isn't about superstition or fear. It's about developing the same kind of spiritual sensitivity that allowed biblical figures to recognize cursed objects and deal with them appropriately. When King Josiah cleansed the temple and destroyed the objects associated with idol worship, he wasn't operating from paranoia. He was exercising spiritual discernment that allowed him to identify which items were spiritually dangerous and needed to be removed. Prayer and seeking God's wisdom before making purchases, especially of antique or used items, can provide supernatural insight into whether an object is safe to bring into your home. Many believers report experiencing strong feelings of uneasiness or spiritual oppression when considering the purchase of certain items, feelings that disappeared when they walked away from those objects. Physical symptoms can also be indicators of cursed objects. Unexplained headaches, feelings of anxiety or depression, sleep disturbances, or other health problems that begin after acquiring a new item may be signs that the object carries spiritual contamination. Families that experience sudden increases in conflict, financial problems, or other patterns of misfortune after bringing certain objects into their homes should consider the possibility that those items are spiritually dangerous. But recognition is only the first step. What should you do if you suspect that an object in your possession is cursed? The biblical pattern is clear. Such items should be completely destroyed, not just removed from your home or given to someone else. Remember how the Ephesians dealt with their occult books after converting to Christianity. Acts chapter 19 tells us that they brought their books of magic together and burned them publicly, even though the books were worth 50,000 pieces of silver. They didn't try to sell them or give them away. They recognized that these objects were spiritually dangerous and needed to be completely destroyed so they couldn't harm anyone else. This principle applies to modern cursed objects as well. Items that carry spiritual contamination shouldn't be donated to charity shops where they could affect other families. They shouldn't be sold at yard sales or given as gifts. According to biblical principles, they should be destroyed completely, removed from circulation so they can't continue to spread spiritual darkness. But what about valuable antiques or family heirlooms that may be cursed? This is where the investigation becomes deeply personal. The Bible makes it clear that no object, no matter how valuable or sentimentally important, is worth keeping if it brings spiritual danger to your family. The Israelites learned this lesson repeatedly throughout their history. Every time they tried to preserve objects associated with idol worship or occult practices, those items eventually led them back into spiritual rebellion and divine judgment. The only safe approach was complete destruction, even when the objects had significant monetary or emotional value. This principle challenges many of our modern assumptions about material possessions. We live in a culture that places enormous value on antiques, collectibles, and family heirlooms. The idea of destroying something valuable because it might be spiritually dangerous seems extreme to most people. But the biblical evidence is overwhelming. Compromising on this issue leads to spiritual contamination that can affect entire families for generations. Consider the long-term consequences of keeping a cursed object compared to the short-term loss of destroying it. Is any antique worth risking your family's spiritual well-being? Is any collectible valuable enough to justify exposing your children to potential supernatural influences that could affect their entire lives? These questions become even more urgent when we consider the possibility that some cursed objects from biblical times are still circulating in the modern world, disguised as historical artifacts or archaeological discoveries. Museums, private collectors, and antique dealers may unknowingly be handling objects that once played roles in the spiritual darkness that repeatedly overwhelmed God's people. The international trade in biblical-era artifacts has exploded over the past century, driven by enormous demand from collectors and institutions around the world. Ancient pottery, jewelry, weapons, religious items, and household objects from the biblical period are bought and sold regularly, often with little or no investigation into their specific historical associations. What if a piece of pottery for sale in a Jerusalem antiquities shop once held oil used in rituals to Baal? What if an ancient bronze vessel displayed in a museum once contained the blood of children sacrificed to Molech? What if jewelry in a private collection once adorned priests who performed abominations in the high places that brought God's judgment upon Israel? The people handling these objects have no way of knowing their specific histories. Archaeological context is often lost when artifacts are looted from ancient sites and sold through black market channels. Items that should carry warning labels about their potential spiritual dangers are instead presented as fascinating glimpses into biblical history. But the objects remember what they were used for. And according to biblical principles, they may still carry the spiritual contamination that made them so dangerous to God's people thousands of years ago. This brings us to one of the most sobering aspects of our investigation. The cursed objects of biblical times weren't just historical curiosities that affected people long ago. They represent ongoing spiritual realities that continue to influence our world today. The same forces of darkness that worked through ancient cursed objects are still active, still seeking to use material items as conduits for supernatural evil. Understanding this reality should change how we view our relationship with material possessions. Every object we bring into our homes, every antique we purchase, every gift we accept should be evaluated not just for its aesthetic or monetary value, but for its potential spiritual influence on our families. This doesn't mean living in fear or paranoia. It means developing the kind of spiritual wisdom and discernment that allowed biblical figures to navigate a world filled with both blessed and cursed objects. It means understanding that the material and spiritual realms are interconnected in ways that most modern people have forgotten. The biblical accounts of cursed objects aren't just ancient stories. They're warnings about spiritual principles that are still operating today. Objects can carry spiritual influences. Material items can become conduits for supernatural power, both good and evil. And the choices we make about what we allow into our homes can have consequences that extend far beyond what we can see with our physical eyes. But there's hope in this understanding as well. Just as objects can become cursed through association with evil, they can also be blessed through dedication to God and association with righteousness. The Bible speaks of objects that carried divine power and brought blessing to those who possessed them. The staff of Moses that performed miracles in Egypt, the mantle of Elijah that parted the Jordan River, the handkerchiefs and aprons that Paul had touched and that brought healing to the sick. The same spiritual principles that can make objects dangerous can also make them instruments of blessing and protection. Homes that are dedicated to God become sanctuaries where His presence dwells. Objects that are blessed and set apart for holy purposes can carry spiritual power that brings healing and protection to families. This is why the investigation of biblical cursed objects ultimately points us toward a deeper understanding of spiritual reality. We live in a world where the material and supernatural realms intersect in ways that most people never consider. Objects, places, and even people can become conduits for spiritual influences that shape the course of human events. The cursed objects of biblical history were warnings about what happens when people try to manipulate spiritual power for selfish purposes, or when they allow material items to replace their relationship with the living God. These ancient artifacts were destroyed or hidden away not because they were archaeologically unimportant, but because they were spiritually dangerous. And that danger hasn't disappeared with the passage of time. The same spiritual forces that worked through ancient cursed objects are still active today, still seeking to use material items as weapons in the ongoing war between good and evil. Understanding this reality is the first step toward protecting ourselves and our families from influences we can't see, but that can profoundly affect our lives. The investigation continues, but the evidence is already overwhelming. Cursed objects from biblical times weren't just religious folklore or ancient superstition. They were real artifacts that carried real spiritual power and brought real consequences to those who possessed them. And the principles that made them dangerous are still operating in our world today. The question we must ask ourselves is this: in a world where ancient spiritual forces still operate through material objects, where cursed artifacts from biblical times may still exist in hidden collections, and where modern items can become contaminated through association with supernatural evil, how do we navigate this invisible minefield that surrounds us every day? The answer lies in understanding something that most people have completely forgotten. The same God who pronounced judgment upon the cursed objects of biblical history is still actively protecting those who seek His wisdom and guidance. The same spiritual discernment that allowed righteous kings like Josiah and Hezekiah to identify and destroy dangerous artifacts is still available to believers today. But here's what's truly remarkable about this investigation. As we've traced the history of these cursed objects from their biblical origins to their potential modern locations, we've uncovered something that changes everything. These artifacts weren't just random items that happened to become spiritually dangerous. They were part of a deliberate strategy, a coordinated attack by forces of darkness against God's people and his plan for humanity. Think about the pattern we've discovered. Every major cursed object in biblical history appeared at crucial moments when God's people were on the verge of spiritual breakthrough or divine blessing. The golden calf emerged just as Moses was receiving the law that would establish Israel as a holy nation. Gideon's ephod became corrupted right after one of Israel's greatest military victories. The bronze serpent turned into an idol during a period when the kingdom should have been experiencing unprecedented blessing under righteous leadership. This isn't coincidence. It's spiritual warfare at its most sophisticated level. Dark forces have always understood that the most effective way to destroy God's people isn't through direct attack, but through spiritual seduction. Create objects that promise power, blessing, or connection to the divine. Then use those very objects to lead people away from the true source of spiritual life. And this strategy is still being employed today. In archaeological sites around the world, in private collections, in museums and antique shops, cursed objects from biblical times may still be circulating, still carrying out their original mission of spiritual deception and destruction. But now they're operating in a world where most people have lost the ability to recognize spiritual danger when they encounter it. Consider the implications for modern believers. We live in an age of unprecedented material abundance, where people collect artifacts from every culture and time period without any thought to their spiritual history. Ancient religious objects, items that may have been used in idol worship or occult practices, are bought and sold as decorative pieces or conversation starters. A fragment of pottery from a Canaanite high place might sit on someone's mantelpiece, labelled as an interesting archaeological find. A piece of jewellery that once adorned a priest of Baal could be displayed in a museum case, admired for its craftsmanship, while visitors remain completely unaware of its spiritual contamination. Bronze fragments that might have come from an ancient idol could be sold at auction to collectors who see only historical value, not spiritual danger. But the most disturbing aspect of this modern circulation of potentially cursed objects is how they're affecting families without anyone understanding what's happening. Unexplained patterns of illness, conflict, financial problems, and spiritual oppression may be directly connected to cursed artifacts that people have unknowingly brought into their homes. Real estate agents in certain regions have learned to ask specific questions about the history of properties they're showing, not just for legal disclosure, but because of repeated patterns they've observed. Homes that seem perfect on paper become sources of ongoing problems for every family that tries to live there. The common factor isn't structural issues or environmental problems. It's spiritual contamination that remains from previous owners' involvement with cursed objects or occult practices. Insurance companies have begun tracking unusual claim patterns associated with certain types of antique purchases. Families who acquire specific categories of ancient artifacts experience statistically significant increases in accidents, illnesses, and property damage. While the companies don't officially recognize spiritual causes, the data patterns are unmistakable to anyone willing to look beyond materialistic explanations. Medical professionals in areas with high concentrations of biblical archaeological sites report seeing clusters of symptoms that don't fit standard diagnostic categories. Patients present with combinations of physical, emotional, and psychological problems that began after acquiring or being exposed to ancient artifacts. Traditional treatments prove ineffective, but the symptoms often disappear when the objects are removed from the patient's environments. These modern manifestations of ancient spiritual principles reveal something crucial about the nature of cursed objects. Their power isn't diminished by time or cultural change. If anything, they may be more dangerous now than they were in biblical times, because modern people lack the spiritual framework to recognize and deal with supernatural threats. But there's another dimension to this investigation that we haven't fully explored? What about the objects that were never found, never destroyed, never recovered from their ancient hiding places? Biblical accounts tell us that many cursed artifacts were buried, hidden away, or lost during times of war and upheaval. These items may still be waiting in underground chambers, sealed caves, or forgotten vaults, their spiritual power intact after thousands of years of concealment. Archaeological expeditions continue to uncover previously unknown sites throughout the biblical world. Each new discovery brings the possibility of finding objects that carry with them the accumulated spiritual darkness of thousands of years. And unlike the cursed artifacts that are already circulating in collections and museums, these newly discovered objects would enter the modern world with their spiritual contamination completely unsuspected and unrecognized. Consider what happened when Heinrich Schliemann discovered what he believed to be the treasure of King Priam at Troy. The golden artifacts he recovered were beautiful, valuable, and historically significant. But they also carried with them a curse that seemed to follow everyone who possessed them. Wars, divorces, mysterious deaths, and financial ruin plagued the families and institutions associated with these ancient treasures. Now imagine that same scenario playing out with objects that have direct connections to the spiritual rebellion and divine judgment recorded in biblical history. What if someone discovered the hidden treasury of a Canaanite temple, filled with golden vessels that were used in child sacrifice rituals? What if archaeologists uncovered a cache of ritual objects from one of the high places that brought God's wrath upon Israel? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. Archaeological discoveries of exactly these types are made regularly throughout the Middle East. Ancient temples are excavated, ritual sites are uncovered, and objects associated with practices that the Bible specifically condemns as abominations are brought to light and distributed to museums and private collections around the world. The people handling these discoveries have no framework for understanding their potential spiritual danger. They see archaeological treasure, historical artifacts that provide insight into ancient cultures. They don't see objects that may have been specifically created to channel demonic power, or that became cursed through association with practices that brought divine judgment upon entire nations. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that some of these cursed objects are being deliberately sought out by modern practitioners of darkness. Just as the Nazis sent expeditions around the world searching for artifacts of supernatural power, there are contemporary groups that actively hunt for objects with connections to ancient occult practices. These modern seekers aren't interested in the historical or archaeological value of biblical artifacts. They're specifically looking for objects that carry spiritual contamination, items that they believe can be reactivated and used as weapons in contemporary spiritual warfare. And unlike ancient peoples who at least understood the dangers they were dealing with, these modern occultists often have no comprehension of the forces they're attempting to manipulate. Secret societies, occult organizations, and practitioners of various forms of modern witchcraft have been known to pay enormous sums for artifacts with alleged connections to ancient magical practices. They perform rituals over these objects, attempting to awaken whatever spiritual forces may be dormant within them. In many cases, they succeed beyond their wildest expectations and quickly discover that they've unleashed powers far beyond their ability to control. Reports from law enforcement agencies that investigate occult-related crimes describe crime scenes where ancient artifacts were found surrounded by evidence of rituals gone horribly wrong. Practitioners who thought they were summoning controllable spiritual forces instead encountered malevolent entities that turned on their supposed masters. The cursed objects they had acquired became focal points for supernatural activity that terrorized entire communities. But even more concerning are the cases where these experiments appear to have succeeded, at least initially. Cursed objects from biblical times, reactivated through modern occult practices, may be operating as spiritual weapons in contemporary conflicts. Items that once brought plague and destruction to ancient cities could be carrying out similar missions in modern urban centers. Consider the implications. If a fragment of an altar used for child sacrifice in biblical times falls into the hands of modern Satanists, and if they successfully reactivate its spiritual properties through ritual, what kind of influence might that object exert on the surrounding community? If pottery shards from vessels used in divination and necromancy are incorporated into contemporary occult practices, what spiritual doors might be opened that were meant to remain sealed? These questions go beyond archaeology and history into the realm of ongoing spiritual warfare. The cursed objects of biblical times weren't just ancient problems. They were weapons in a cosmic conflict that continues to this day, and some of those weapons may still be in active use. This brings us to one of the most important revelations of our entire investigation. The biblical accounts of cursed objects aren't just historical records or religious teachings. They're intelligence reports from an ongoing war, detailed descriptions of enemy weapons and tactics that are still being employed against God's people today. Understanding this reality changes everything about how we should approach material possessions, archaeological discoveries, and even routine purchases of antique items. We're not just consumers in a global marketplace. We're participants in a spiritual conflict where objects can serve as weapons and where ignorance of spiritual principles can make us vulnerable to attacks we never see coming. But there's hope in this understanding as well. The same God who gave his people victory over cursed objects in biblical times is still actively protecting those who seek his guidance and wisdom. The same spiritual discernment that allowed righteous leaders to identify and destroy dangerous artifacts is still available to believers today. The key is developing the spiritual sensitivity to recognize when an object carries contamination that could affect our families. This isn't about living in fear or paranoia. It's about understanding spiritual reality well enough to navigate safely through a world where material and supernatural forces intersect in ways that most people never consider. Prayer, seeking godly counsel, and paying attention to spiritual impressions when considering purchases or gifts can provide supernatural insight into whether objects are safe to bring into our homes. Many believers report experiencing clear warnings, feelings of uneasiness, physical discomfort, or spiritual oppression when considering the acquisition of certain items. These impressions should be taken seriously, not dismissed as imagination or superstition. The same spiritual sensitivity that warns us about cursed objects can also guide us toward items that carry blessing and protection. The principles work in both directions, but recognition is only the beginning. What we do with potentially cursed objects determines whether they continue to spread spiritual contamination or whether their influence is permanently broken. The biblical pattern is clear. Such items must be completely destroyed, not just removed from our possession or given to someone else. This principle challenges our modern assumptions about recycling, donation, and the sharing of material resources. We've been taught that it's wasteful to destroy anything that might have value to someone else. But when it comes to spiritually contaminated objects, giving them away or selling them simply transfers the danger to other families. The Ephesians understood this when they brought their occult books together and burned them publicly. Even though the books were worth a fortune, they recognized that some objects are too dangerous to allow into circulation, regardless of their monetary value. The spiritual safety of their community was more important than financial considerations. This same principle applies to modern cursed objects, whether they're ancient artifacts or contemporary items that have become contaminated through association with supernatural rebellion. Complete destruction is the only safe option, even when it involves significant financial loss or emotional attachment. But what about family heirlooms, or objects with deep sentimental value that may carry spiritual contamination? This is where the investigation becomes deeply personal and requires the kind of spiritual courage that most people find difficult to muster. The Bible makes it clear that no object, no matter how valuable or emotionally significant, is worth keeping if it brings spiritual danger to our families. The Israelites learned this lesson repeatedly throughout their history. Every time they tried to preserve objects associated with idol worship or occult practices, those items eventually led them back into spiritual rebellion and divine judgment. King Josiah's reforms provide the perfect example of how to handle this dilemma. When he discovered that objects in the temple itself had become associated with idolatrous practices, he didn't hesitate to destroy them completely, even though they were valuable religious artifacts that had been part of Israel's worship for generations. The spiritual purity of the nation was more important than preserving historical objects. This principle applies with equal force to modern situations. A family heirloom that brings spiritual oppression must be destroyed, regardless of its sentimental value. An antique that causes unexplained problems must be eliminated, even if it's worth thousands of dollars. A collectible that creates spiritual disturbance must be removed permanently, no matter how much effort went into acquiring it. These decisions require the kind of spiritual maturity that puts eternal values above temporary attachments. But the alternative, keeping cursed objects for sentimental or financial reasons while they slowly poison our family's spiritual atmosphere, is far more costly in the long run. The investigation of biblical cursed objects ultimately points us toward a deeper understanding of how spiritual and material realities intersect in our daily lives. We live in a world where objects can carry spiritual influences, where material possessions can become conduits for supernatural forces, and where the choices we make about what we allow into our homes can have consequences that extend far beyond what we can see with our physical eyes. This understanding should transform how we approach every aspect of our material lives. Shopping becomes a spiritual exercise requiring discernment and prayer. Decorating our homes becomes an opportunity to create environments that invite God's presence rather than spiritual contamination. Even accepting gifts requires wisdom to discern whether the items being offered carry blessing or danger. But perhaps most importantly, understanding the reality of cursed objects helps us appreciate the incredible protection that God provides for those who walk in relationship with Him. The same power that destroyed the cursed objects of biblical times is still available to believers today. The same spiritual authority that allowed righteous leaders to cleanse their nations of dangerous artifacts is still operating through the church. We don't have to live in fear of cursed objects, whether ancient or modern, but we do need to live with spiritual awareness, understanding that the material world around us is influenced by supernatural forces that require supernatural wisdom to navigate safely. The cursed objects of biblical history weren't just ancient problems. They were warnings about spiritual principles that continue to operate in our world today. Objects can become weapons in spiritual warfare. Material possessions can influence our relationship with God. And the things we choose to surround ourselves with can either draw us closer to divine blessing or expose us to supernatural danger. As we conclude this investigation, remember that knowledge brings responsibility. Understanding the reality of cursed objects means we can no longer make casual decisions about what we bring into our homes or what we expose our families to. Every purchase, every gift, every antique or collectible must be evaluated not just for its aesthetic or monetary value, but for its potential spiritual impact. The war between good and evil continues, and objects remain one of the battlefields where that conflict is fought. But armed with biblical wisdom and spiritual discernment, we can navigate this battlefield safely, protecting our families from dangers they never see, while creating homes that serve as sanctuaries of God's presence and blessing. The cursed objects of biblical times may still be out there, hidden in collections or waiting to be discovered in ancient ruins. But they need not terrify us. The same God who pronounced judgment upon them has given us authority over every spiritual force that would seek to harm us. In His name, Even the most cursed object loses its power, and even the darkest spiritual contamination must flee. This is our hope, our protection, and our victory. Not in our own wisdom or strength, but in the unchanging power of the God who has already won the ultimate victory over every force of darkness. The cursed objects of biblical history were real, they were dangerous, and some may still exist today. But for those who walk in covenant relationship with the living God, they are nothing more than defeated enemies whose time of influence is coming to an end. The investigation is complete, but the vigilance must continue. Stay alert, stay prayerful, and remember, in a world filled with both blessed and cursed objects, spiritual discernment isn't just helpful, it's essential for survival.